Hey YouTube, thanks for tuning in. Andy here. This video is going to be an in-depth review of the Lenovo Ideapad 530S. I've been using this as my personal laptop for the last 3 months and as my do-everything PC for the last week. In this video, I'm going to take a look at the performance of the Ideapad 530S, the battery life, the display. We're going to open it up and look at the internals and the upgradability and much more. But we're going to get started by taking a look at the build quality of the Ideapad 530S. So let's get started. The Ideapad 530S is an all-aluminum Ultrabook, which very much resembles other models in Lenovo's Ideapad and Yoga lines. Mine has a black finish, which appears to be a similar coating used on the Yoga line. While this coating does look nice, it is prone to scratching since it's softer than the metal that's underneath it. My Ideapad 530S hasn't had any scratching issues so far, though I haven't traveled a whole lot with it. My old Yoga 730-13 definitely did pick up some scratches, even with pretty light use where it wasn't getting, abused. So I do expect the same story will play out with the 530S. Getting into the laptop is quite easy by removing just a few Torx screws. This gives you access to one RAM slot and the PCIe M.2 slot. And that's all the RAM you'll get. There's no RAM soldered on board, so whatever you have in that one slot is it. And that does mean that there's no dual channel RAM, which is unfortunate, but hey, at least it's user upgradable, at least somewhat. My laptop came with 8 gigabytes of RAM, and I replaced that stick with a 16 gigabyte stick, so that's a pretty nice option to have. The trackpad and the keyboard are both good, but not great. The trackpad is a nice size, it has a smooth glass texture that's lovely to touch, and it also offers a short, sharp click that I consider about as good as it gets on Windows laptops. The only thing holding it back from being a great trackpad is that it doesn't feel quite as precise as other trackpads, just in terms of actually tracking your finger. It's good, but it's not quite as good as some others I've used, like my old Yoga 730 that I already mentioned, or also my X1 Carbon. So it's a really good trackpad, but it could be better. The keyboard on the Ideapad 530S is very nice to type on. The keys are nicely spaced and they have that classic Lenovo shape, sort of the U shape, which I think is a really nice shape and layout. These keys are a little bit shallower than what you'd get on a ThinkPad, something like the X1 or a T490, but they do offer a noticeably firmer resistance than some other Lenovo laptops in the consumer lineup, like my old Lenovo Yoga 730 that I'm mentioning all the time. That one of the few complaints I really had on that laptop in my review was that the keys were very easy to accidentally press. This one, the keys are a whole lot firmer, so that's much less of an issue. The backlighting has 2 different stages, so I guess 3 if you count off. So off, low, and then high. And there's very little backlight bleed, which is nice. That's one of the advantages of having these slightly shallower keys, like the Ideapad 530S has. Bystopper number 2, for Ultrabooks at least, is the display. Ultrabooks are meant to be used on the go, so you're going to be using the screen more often than something like a gaming or a workstation laptop, which most people will use at their desk most of the time and have hooked up to a full-size monitor. Unfortunately, I don't really have any calibration equipment to test the screens, so I'm largely evaluating the display just based on my general impressions, and then also comparing it to displays that I know are calibrated at the factory, like on my iPhone. My 530S did come with a 1440 display, which is definitely nice as an amateur photographer who does enjoy to pixel peep. It can help you tell if something is fully sharp or just kind of sharp. Windows DPI scaling has also gotten really good now, so I almost never notice any weird issues with Windows DPI scaling like I used to, where stuff would get really big or really small. So there's not really a great reason to avoid the high DPI screens like there was a couple of years ago. I guess battery life is affected, so that is one reason. Image quality on the display in my Ideapad 530S at least is a tale of 2 brightnesses. So like I mentioned, to try to get the screen as accurate as possible, I basically compared it right up against my iPhone. I put the Ideapad 530S at maximum brightness and matched the iPhone to it, which was about 80%. And this is an iPhone 6S, so a little bit of an older iPhone. And then I use the Intel HD graphics settings tool to adjust the colors and the contrast and all those different settings until they match as closely as possible. And I have to say, at the maximum brightness, which I do think is about 275 nits, just guessing there, like I said, don't have any testing equipment. But at the maximum brightness, I'm actually quite pleased with the colors I was able to get just from doing that little bit of tweaking, matching it up to my iPhone screen. Like I said, I'm an amateur photographer, so I was very pleased going through looking at some of my pictures. They look really great on the screen when the brightness is turned up. Either all the way or at least to the top 3 levels or so, things look really good. Unfortunately, the problem with the screen, or why it's not a great screen or even really that good of a screen in my opinion, is that after making those calibration changes to get it a little more accurate in terms of color, once the brightness goes down below sort of those top 3 settings, the contrast starts to fall off pretty badly and text can actually become quite difficult to read. And that's unfortunately going to affect you because the main time that I have the brightness turned down is if I'm just using the laptop in bed or something, most of the time, which I would be reading text. So unfortunately, that's a little bit of a bummer. The default settings for the color calibration on this screen do have the contrast turned up quite a bit from where I tuned it to match the iPhone screen. So restoring the default settings does help quite a bit on the lower brightnesses, but you're not getting as accurate of photos at higher brightnesses. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there in terms of the color accuracy. That's why I say the image quality and the color accuracy is sort of a tale of 2 brightnesses. At high brightness, you can definitely tune this to be really accurate. At lower brightnesses, you're going to have the contrast sort of bumped up unrealistically, which is going to distort the colors and image accuracy. So the screen is good. It's really nice to look at. The default settings are perfectly fine just for like watching videos and consuming content. But if you do want really any sort of color accuracy, you're going to have to tune it, and then you do run into that drawback at lower brightnesses. So it's a good screen. I love the sharpness on it, but it's not the best screen out there if you want color accuracy. All right, connectivity on the Ideapad 530S is quite good, with 2 unfortunate exceptions, but we're going to start with the positive. So for a relatively thin and light performance Ultrabook, the 530S does weigh in at 3.3 pounds, and this is a 14-inch display. I don't think I've mentioned either of those yet, so good to mention the size and the weight, and pretty slim bezel, so a nice small footprint. But so for a laptop that size, and it's pretty slim, it does have a pretty good port selection. So we're talking 2 USB-A ports, 1 USB-C port, a full-size HDMI port, a headphone jack, and a full-size SD card reader. Wow, in 2019, that's a pretty sweet collection of ports. Not many laptops, or a lot of laptops that are not a whole lot smaller than this, so pretty comparable in size, are only giving you like 2 USB-C ports and a headphone jack. That's what my old Yoga 730 did, and it was a bummer not having any USB-A ports, and certainly having 2 is a luxury if you're going to be using this to do actual work on, where you need to maybe plug in a flash drive while you have a mouse plugged in at the same time. It's crazy, but who would do that? But it's a nice option to have. So all those ports are really great. Moving on to networking, there's no Ethernet port, so nothing to measure there. But the Wi-Fi performance for a laptop that's in the mid-range price range is very good. So my unit at least came with an Intel AC8265 Wi-Fi card, which I actually bought one to put into my old Yoga 730 because it's a pretty good mid-range Wi-Fi card. And I've had no problems maxing out my 100 megabit internet over Wi-Fi on it, though obviously that's not super high speed, but I've been very pleased with the Wi-Fi. And this is actually including areas where other devices, I sometimes have Wi-Fi reception issues, and it's done better than other devices. So very pleased with the Wi-Fi, at least in my Ideapad 530S. I know sometimes laptops come with different Wi-Fi cards, so if you get one of these, hopefully it has the Intel AC8265 like mine does. All right, so it's time to talk about those 2 exceptions to the otherwise nice connectivity. So those 2 sort of issues that I mentioned at the top. So one of them is with that USB-C port I talked about earlier, and there are 2 issues with that USB-C port. So the first issue is that there's no Thunderbolt support at all. So not even 2-lane Thunderbolt support. So there's just no chance of using an external GPU or getting some sort of a dock or like really high-speed external storage on this laptop. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen. USB 3.1 is as fast as you're going to get, which is pretty fast. But man, Thunderbolt 3, there's so many great peripherals out there for high performance if you're looking at this laptop to actually use in a performance workflow, since it does have that dedicated GPU. So that's a bummer. The other issue I have with the USB-C port is that unfortunately it doesn't do power delivery either. So like I said, I have an X1 Carbon at work, which does use USB-C charging, and I tried my charger for that on the 530S, and nothing at all. So no power delivery on the USB-C port. It's not a huge deal, but having that separate dedicated barrel plug adapter is a little bit, feels a little bit dated in 2019. So USB-C charging would have been nice to have. Speaking of the barrel plug AC adapter, this one is just the single cord where it just plugs straight into the wall outlet or into whatever outlet you're plugging it into, and it is a little bit of a short cord, in my opinion. So that's just one thing I've noticed. It's not the longest cord, so if you spend a lot of time, plugging into outlets in coffee shops or at school, you might want to actually, if you're considering this or you find a good deal on one, you might even want to pick up a second adapter from Lenovo on their website, get one that has a longer cord. Day-to-day performance is exactly what you'd expect from an 8th gen Ultrabook CPU. Web browsing and Photoshop are handled with ease, though even web browsing alone has a tendency to kick in the fans pretty regularly. The fans aren't as loud as a gaming laptop, but it is a relatively high-pitched whine, which if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, you may find that annoying. What really fixed the sort of annoyance of the fans kicking on regularly for me, actually I found two fixes, but the one I've sort of stuck with since I've been using this laptop for everything recently has been to go into the BIOS for the Ideapad 530S and put it into high performance mode. And what that means is that the fans run pretty much almost all the time. If it's even slightly warm, the fans run. So that way I just get used to hearing the noise of the fans nonstop. The other fix that I actually used for a while when I was still using this in conjunction with a desktop is undervolting it, or not undervolting it actually, but turning off the turbo boost. So downloading Throttle Stop is the name of the program. Sorry, my mind went blank there for a moment. But if you download the Throttle Stop application, you can actually use that to adjust just different properties on the power consumption of your CPU as someone rides by on their motorbike because it's summer. And so just turning off the turbo boost and keeping it locked in at the 2.2 gigahertz stock clock, I found that actually prevented the fans from coming on almost all the time. And I didn't notice a performance for web browsing and normal day-to-day tasks. So that's actually a pretty sweet solution that also improves battery life. But if you're going to be using it heavy duty, I say just go throw it in high performance mode and get used to the fan noise. So I haven't done a ton of high-performance gaming, but the gaming I have done so far has been solid, and the thermal issues don't seem to really impact gaming performance or even GPU temperatures that much, fortunately. So I haven't tried a ton of different games, but the two most demanding games I have tried are Madden 19 and Overwatch. In Madden 19, things ran well on medium settings at 720p, which is a little bit of an unfortunate resolution to be running at on a 1440p display, and my external display is 1440p as well. But it's pretty doable, and once you're actually in the game, you don't notice it too much. Other than Madden, you could sort of tell it's not optimized for 720p, because there are just some spots where things don't look the greatest. So even at 720p with medium settings, it wasn't a steady 60 FPS, but I didn't really notice any stuttering, and I think it was definitely well above 30, because it looked pretty smooth, and once I actually got into the game, I wasn't really noticing it at all or thinking about performance, which is good. That's exactly what you want when you're playing a game. So moving on to Overwatch, which fortunately features resolution scaling, which means that I was able to run at the native resolution of 1440p, and then turn on the resolution scaling to its lowest option to 50%, which is actually pretty nice because that means I'm getting that 720p quality scaled up, exactly 200%, so linear scale. So it should, in theory, look, the best kind of scaling. And unfortunately, I did have to turn the graphics settings all the way down to low to get a really stutter-free experience. Again, I'm not sure I was hitting a solid 60 FPS there, but definitely in the 40s almost all the time, and no noticeable stutters once I set it to low. I did have it on medium at proper or at 1080p prior to that, and seemed to have a pretty stutter-free experience. But cranking it up, even turning the resolution scaling down, I did have to drop it to low. But it still looked pretty good, and certainly while I was playing, I didn't notice any graphics or any performance issues that were distracting. So a pretty good gaming experience for those two games, at least if you don't mind turning the graphics down. So I know there are definitely more demanding games, even though those are both a little bit demanding. So there will be games that this probably can't handle at all, even right now, in a playable state, even at 720p. So definitely, if gaming is a huge priority for you, this is probably not the machine for you. But that MX 150 does give you the flexibility to do some pretty real gaming. All right, so when we talk about heavier workloads outside of gaming, thermal throttling is definitely going to be an issue if you're pushing the CPU. So in video editing, when you're actually jumping around the timeline, you can sometimes avoid it. It kind of depends what you're doing. If you're throwing on effects, absolutely, you're going to hit thermal throttling relatively quickly once you start stacking them up, where there's just time that it's working on rendering those effects. And then when you're doing your output render, even with the Intel iGPU, that is going to put heat in the CPU area, and you are going to see some thermal throttling there. But fortunately, it seems to stabilize at around 2.5 gigahertz. So you're not dropping all the way down to stock clock speeds, but you won't be hitting anywhere near that 4 gigahertz boost clock when you're under a steady CPU load. That's normal due to the power consumption limits on those boost speeds anyway. Performance in this regard has been very similar to my work X1 Carbon, but obviously the dedicated GPU does add a nice performance boost for gaming, and then also for Photoshop and Premiere, especially in Premiere on the timeline. Having a dedicated graphics card, even an MX 150, makes a very noticeable difference when you're working with like 4K footage. So very nice performance, but obviously, this is a slim machine. There will be some thermal throttling, so bear that in mind. I have not repasted this machine yet, but it's pretty easy to get into, so I'm very seriously considering doing that. And if I do, I'll make another video and report back if things improve at all in terms of the thermal situation. All right, so I'm going to briefly touch on battery life. And so far, I've been getting 5 to 6 hours of usage on this when I'm running it on battery. But when I'm using it on battery, it's pretty light usage, so usually just web browsing. It may be, instant messaging, occasionally hopping into Photoshop for 5 or 10 minutes, doing a little bit of that. But no heavy usage, no video editing, no gaming, certainly. Those are all things that I do when I have this at my desk hooked up to my bigger screen. So like I said, I've been getting 5 to 6 hours of battery life. This does have a 48 watt hour battery, which is the same size as my old Yoga 13. This is very similar battery life to my Yoga 13. The screen brightness seems very similar to my old Yoga 13. So nothing about this is surprising, that 5 to 6 hours of battery life. Obviously, if you are gaming or doing something more demanding that kicks in that DGPU, battery life will plummet on this. So it would drop, I would guess if you're like gaming, as low as 2 to 3 hours. So battery life will vary, but for general usage, you're going to see about 5 to 6 hours on this. All right, so let's talk about value, which is really always the bottom line factor in purchasing decisions. And it seems a bit tough to evaluate for the 530S, as it doesn't seem to actually be on sale in that many places. So I paid $550 for my 530S, which came with a 256 gig SSD and 8 gigs of RAM, both of which I upgraded on my own. I already had a 512 gig SSD, and I paid about $70 to upgrade the RAM from 8 gigs to 16 gigs. I feel like that's actually pretty good value for an 8550U and an MX 150 in a sleek metal body, even though the thermals aren't so great. You just don't see new laptops with those specs at $550 very often. In fact, that's really the only time I've seen it. With that said, I did buy this on eBay in what I suspect was a pretty good deal. So it was a buy it now listing. I was sorting by newly listed. I was looking for ThinkPad deals, and this one popped up, $550 for an MX 150 and the i7, and I said, let's do it. Let's try it out. So at $550, if you're looking for an Ultrabook with a little bit of graphics horsepower, this is a great value. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that $550 is the standard price for this configuration, with it generally going for more like $800 to $1,000. Like I said, it isn't actually on sale at major retailers like Amazon or Newegg, at least that I've found, so it's pretty much eBay and smaller websites found through Google that will have it. At that kind of price, it's more challenging to gauge the value. There's so many $800 Ultrabooks with Thunderbolt 3 support that I'd be highly tempted to pick a model like that and add an eGPU for even more graphics oomph than the MX 150 can provide. If you need that graphics oomph on the go though, it may still be a better option with the 530S, especially if you also want the extra ports. Though if you do want dedicated graphics on the go, I'd be highly tempted to swing for something with a GTX 1050, which does also get shoved into many Ultrabooks with thermal issues. Alright, so that was quite a journey, and at the end of it, I think we're left with the question that we're always left with at the end of a tech review, which is, should you consider buying this? So what it has going for it is that it's a well-built machine. It feels very high quality to me. Keyboard, trackpad, solid. Solid performance, so the thermals, like we saw, they could be better. So repasting is something that I might look into doing. And great ports and expandability. The SD card reader, that's something that's super handy to have if you're a photographer. And having that dedicated GPU on the go, nice extra power if you're editing a lot of pictures or editing video. However, the lack of Thunderbolt 3 is a pretty serious weakness if this is a machine that you're planning to use for several years and that you want to use for relatively high performance tasks. That MX 150 GPU is better than nothing, but it would be really nice to be able to hook this up to like a 1050 or a 1060, something with quite a bit more oomph, where you could play graphics or games at basically desktop level graphics. That would be really nice. Unfortunately, not an option here. Whereas on a lot of other $800 to $1,000 machines, Thunderbolt 3 is an option. But those are almost always missing the ports and missing that dedicated GPU. So that's where the trade-offs come into play. At the end of the day, if you can snag a sweet eBay deal like I did for $550, this is a no-brainer. If you're paying the typical retail price I've seen, $800 to $1,000, then it really depends if you want those ports, the SD card reader, and the mobile GPU that you can use on the go. If you want those more than Thunderbolt 3, then this is definitely something you should consider. Otherwise, I would probably lean towards Thunderbolt 3. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions about the Lenovo Ideapad 530S, definitely feel free to post them in the comments and I will try to get you an answer. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.